Hi, everybody. I'm Brittany Lewis, a breaking news reporter here at Forbes. Joining me now is Andrew Wilson, Deputy Secretary General and Global Policy Director at the ICC. Andrew, thank you so much for joining me once again.
Great to be with you, Brittany.
Within the past week, we have gotten two major developments when it comes to trade. So I would love to talk with you about them both. First, last week, President Trump unveiled details of the framework for a new trade deal between the U.S. and the U.K. And just over the weekend, the United States and China agreed to temporarily majorly reduce tariffs for 90 days as negotiations between the two countries continue on. So to start off the conversation, what are your takeaways from the last week when it comes to trade negotiations?
Well, it's a dramatic time to be working in the area of trade policy, that's for sure. I've never experienced anything like that in my circa 20-year career. I think it's quite interesting to look at what we're seeing today on Wall Street following the USChina announcement. Clearly, I think the financial markets are breathing a huge sigh of relief that the potential decoupling between the world's two largest economies can be averted. That's a tremendously important signal, without any shadow of a doubt. I think when we talk to businesses, though, across our network, the response to both the US-China deal and also the smaller deal with the United Kingdom is a little bit more muted, to be perfectly honest. And I know the administration has called these major deals, and I entirely understand why they use that rhetoric. But I think if you look at this from a business perspective, I think there are three things to know. The first is tariffs are still substantially higher than they were at the start of 2025. The 10% tariff seems to be set in stone, and essentially we seem to be working up from there. Second thing is there's still a huge amount of uncertainty left by these deals, and I know there are many details to fill in, both on the UK and China, but people are asking questions like what rates will apply to certain products, how do different tariffs stack up. I think we're seeing just this morning, Capital Economics is suggesting the effective tariff rate on China may be closer to 40% than 30%. So a lot of unanswered questions in the real economy. And I think the other thing is, certainly with the China deal, it is only a temporary reprieve. It's 90 days. And we really need to see what can happen in terms of future negotiations. Clearly, as well, with the UK, there need to be follow-on negotiations in a number of strategically important areas for the economy and for the UK in particular. And then I think more broadly, the UK deal is relatively limited. And I think many people are saying we now have the United States engaged with a large number, maybe upwards of 70 countries negotiating deals. If a close ally of the United States and a country with relatively balanced trade, and you could say the US has a trade surplus if you include services, if that's the best deal that they can get, what are we looking at in terms of the deals that will be struck with other economies? And I fear that we're turning the economic clock back to the 1930s or the early 1900s, where tariffs become a much more predominant feature of the global economy. And for businesses, it's a huge source of uncertainty, and it is a huge concern to many companies.
I want to first touch on that disconnect you talked about between Wall Street and businesses, because U.S. stocks surged upon the announcement of the U.S.-China tentative agreement as well as the framework for the UK-U.S. deal. But you're saying businesses are having a much more muted reaction. Treasury Secretary Bessent said about the China deal that neither side wants a decoupling, and the high tariffs before were essentially a trade embargo. But right now, the tariffs, China's slashing tariffs from 125% to 10%, and the U.S. is cutting them from 145% to 30%. So is that, I mean, I know that's not a complete embargo, but how much tougher is that going to be for businesses with that tariff rate than pre-2025?
Look, I think it's positive in terms of the US-China trade relationship. It is only a temporary reprieve, so that the uncertainty does still exist, but tariffs at 30% or maybe 40%, if the analysts are right, is certainly more workable. So trade will start flowing again, and essentially the kind of temporary decoupling that I think we started to see in recent weeks should diminish. And I suspect we'll see a surge in exports from China to the US as companies look to fill up their inventories. The one thing it will mean, though, at a 30% tariff is supply chains will not be able to eat those costs in their entirety. 10% companies usually say is manageable, 20% depending on the sector at a push. 30% we're probably looking at significant pass-through costs to American consumers. And that will have an impact on the US economy. It's only US inflation and consumer behavior.
Each side, when it came to the UK-US deal, touted this as a victory. The United States certainly touted the tentative China-US agreement as a victory. Who do you see as the real winners of this deal? From the United States' perspective, do you think it was worth it for them to have this tariff whiplash for a few months, and then these are the deals that are starting to emerge?
I think the jury is out on that, to be perfectly honest. And I start from the position that the United States and the administration have some legitimate concerns about the trade practices of the US's trading partners. China most notably, but certainly not uniquely. So I think it's absolutely understandable that this administration should wish to seek or essentially take a more assertive stance when it comes to trade policy. The question I think we have fundamentally, and many business leaders feel precisely the same, is, are tariffs the right way to go about this? Or are there better ways to seek concessions from trading partners? And would it be better, rather than doing all of this bilaterally through brute force, would it be better to seek multilateral solutions? Our view very clearly is no one will win out of a trade war. No one will win from substantially higher tariffs. They will act fundamentally as a drag on business investment, job creation, and growth. They pose significant risks for the US economy, particularly in terms of inflation and consumer behavior. So I think the analysis that the administration has applied is right in many ways. The prescription that they're now applying to the global economy in the form of tariffs just is not workable as far as we're concerned. So I think it is positive that we're seeing the US now seeking to negotiate bilateral deals. I think to determine whether that is ultimately a good thing for the global economy, we ultimately will need to see the substance of what's in them beyond the headlines of what's been announced so far on the UK and China.
I know that you said something that stuck out to me earlier in this conversation is that these tariffs are turning the economic clock back to the early 1900s. So from that perspective, and I know that there are details missing in both of these trade deals, but what is the impact here on the global economy?
Look, I think what we're seeing is in many ways an unprecedented experiment, applying the blunt tool of tariffs, which in large part kind of disappeared from global commerce as a key barrier, to enormously complex and interdependent supply chains that are built up over many, many years, based in part on historical tariff policies, including, and probably most notably from the US. I think if we end up in a situation in 90 days or in a year's time where tariff levels are substantially higher from the US, and potentially that could trigger other countries to raise their own tariffs, if not against the US, then perhaps against other trading partners, then I think economic history tells us very clearly that that will lead to lower growth, lower innovation, job losses for sure. And in some economies, it will result in inflation. And I think the Yale analysis of the Liberation Day announcements is pretty solid. They predict inflationary pressures of upwards of 4% this year alone. BNP Paribas and other major banks, I think, have made similar projections looking forward to 2026. So there are huge downside risks if the tariffs persist. And I think what we have to hope is The negotiations the US has now entered into will substantially relieve those pressures and allow a lowering, probably to 10%, which now seems an inviolable rule. But if that can be done, then I think that does lift the cloud of trade barriers and the risks of a broader trade war.
I think the theme really in the past couple of months has been uncertainty because we have seen multiple 90-day pauses throughout this whole tariff back and forth. There's scant details coming out of these negotiations except, the bulk headlines. You're saying lower growth, inflation, potential for job loss. I mean, if I'm the everyday consumer, what should I be thinking right now?
I think many consumers and many businesses and small business owners are deeply concerned by the uncertainty, and not just in the United States. I mean, Europe, we see it here as well. I think what we really have to genuinely hope is that this is part of a grand plan, part of a clever negotiating strategy to extract trade concessions from the US as trade partners, and that the tariffs can come down. And I think the message we really need to get across is tariffs are not necessarily an effective instrument to achieve what the US very understandably wants to achieve in terms of rebalancing and reconfiguring global trade.
Is that the global perspective that you're in Europe right now? Are most Europeans thinking that tariffs aren't the right way to go about this? I mean, what is their feeling right now towards the Trump administration and these tariff policies?
I think there's, certainly in terms of the policymakers, the ministers, the business leaders we speak to, there's widespread shock. I think you said the word rightly earlier, uncertainty, which is clouding business, operational, investment decisions. And I think there's a sense that, we've kind of gone back to the future. As I said earlier, we've turned the clock of economic history back to the 1930s, and policy tools that were widely considered outdated, ineffective, highly dangerous, have now come back to the fore of international economic policy. And I think it's striking that I remember after the global financial crisis, there was widespread concern that countries could turn inwards and start to enact protectionist measures, just as they did in the 1930s during the Great Depression. And very quickly, governments came out in unison to reject protectionism, to say we need to keep markets open, we need to keep trade flowing. So this is really a fundamental reversal in international economic policy driven by the United States. As I say, I think the objectives they're aiming for are entirely understandable. There are issues in the international trading system. There are issues with other countries' conduct. The question is, can you do so by other means rather than using the blunt force of tariffs, which are not a recipe for success?
And especially the blunt force of tariffs amongst friends. I mean, the UK and the US have been long-standing allies, and the US has a trade surplus with the UK. So when you're seeing that framework, you see the baseline 10% still in effect, amongst other details. So what does that signal to you, if anything, about future trade agreements with other major trading partners?
As I say, if the deal that was announced last week with the UK is the best that a long-standing ally with pretty balanced trade relations can achieve, then it suggests that other countries are looking at substantially higher tariff levels. And we simply don't know what other countries will be able to offer the United States administration to get those reduced down to the 10%. But I think that the 10% baseline, as it's now become, is really quite interesting. It's almost as if the administration sees this as free money. It's not. It's a 10% tax on American consumers. Some of those costs will be passed on. We know that from previous tariff increases from the first Trump administration under George W. Bush after 9/11. There are pass-through costs. That is an economic risk. and it will make the US market a less attractive environment for investment. And I think that the bigger picture from this as well is tariff instability is not a recipe to resurrect US domestic manufacturing capacity. If that is one of the key policy objectives, which again is completely understandable, but if your tariff rate today is 40%, you may look at making an investment, but only if you know the tariff rate is going to stay there for a long time, because it may take you 10 years, 20 years to actually make money off the facility you plan to build in the US. But if you have tariffs imposed by way of executive order that could change tomorrow, or could change in a year's time, or could change in 4 years under a subsequent president, then I think many businesses will be reluctant or nervous about making those big investments in domestic manufacturing in the US, because you don't know where the tariff rate is going to sit tomorrow, let alone in 4 or 5 years' time.
And that's obviously a message that the Trump administration is not echoing. They're saying, hey, now is a great time for investment in the United States. They're not saying that the US market is undesirable. So when you're looking at that, I mean, what specifically are you looking out for next? Because I know that you don't have a crystal ball. You can't read into the future. There is a lot of uncertainty here. But you seem to be a student of history here based on past tariff policies. So knowing that, I mean, what are you looking out for next?
So I think, I am slightly skeptical about some of the announcements that have been made on inward investment, because I just wonder, will companies really pull the trigger on substantial investments in the US if you don't know what the tariff rate is going to be tomorrow or in a week's time? So I think that uncertainty will continue to cloud investment decisions. I think what we have seen, which is positive, is clearly the administration is not blind to the markets. The president has spoken about the need for American consumers or American voters to experience some pain as part of a readjustment, but clearly they are sensitive to what the markets and what business leaders are telling them. So I think our fundamental hope is that they will continue to be alert to the downside risks to the economy and to the financial markets, and that we can find a way to negotiate our way out of the tariff increases we've seen over the first part of this year, and that the US can really start to rethink, or the US administration can start to rethink how it approaches trade policy. And I'll give you an example. If you're concerned that countries are manipulating their currencies, and I think there's good reason to think that some have in the past to boost their export performance, then, okay, one way is to threaten them with tariffs and get them to appreciate their own currencies. Another way is to form coalitions through the International Monetary Fund, through the World Trade Organization, and look at how they can be held to account with new rules, new enforcement mechanisms, new ways of dispute settlement that could fundamentally address the issue that clearly many people, including the president's lead economic advisor, are very, very concerned about. So I think the answer has to be, I think, in the long term, about a shift in the solutions that the administration is offering. Tariffs are unlikely to work in any substantial way. There are other solutions that can be found, whether it's on currency, whether it's on excessive subsidization of domestic industries, that can be found through multilateral pathways. And I think many of the United States allies and trading partners would be very, very keen to join an effort of that kind.
Well, there's certainly a lot to look out for as we see more deals coming through. And I hope as we do, you come back on and provide your perspective on them. Andrew, thank you so much for joining me. You are welcome back anytime.
Thank you, Brittany.